Oh yeah, it's toasty.
This is part 2 of far red. I've just printed out a larger version of the graph that I showed in last video. So right here is the end of the rough end of the visible range. There still is some far red past it, but the significant portions here from 700 nanometers to 750. Now you'll probably notice some strange splotches on there. That's actually ink solution that I mixed up. I actually found out something interesting about the inks and pens. Specifically the ink and sheet pens. Here I've got a high quality pen here, well high-ish quality I guess, on the bottom there. And then the sheet pen is the top one. That is an index card that I've dyed with the isopropyl solution of ink from multiple cheap pens. As you can see, it's not exactly black, is it? And that's obviously exaggerated from what it looks like in real life, but it has a very clear red tinge to it in real life from the far red. So I'm filming with a 300 watt incandescent bulb. Here is 2 flashlights. The first one, the silver one that you recognize from the last video, is no longer a 730 nanometer. I got my hands on some brighter but still far red 3 watt 710 nanometer LEDs. And then the top one is a standard 660 nanometer red. So, if you haven't guessed by now, the cheap inks and pens are transparent to far red. That's what gives them that strange color. If you pay attention carefully to the color of ink and pens under the proper lighting, you'll be able to see that the higher quality pens have the solid black color you would expect, while the cheap pens have a slightly dark red colored ink to them. Not fully black, there's some red coloring to it. And it'll be a lot more obvious if you take that ink, dissolve it in isopropyl, and then paint it onto something, like this index card here. Let me see if I can just color a bit with these pen. This is the good one. And this is the cheap one. Here's a close-up. You can see that the good pen left a dark mark there, black as you would expect. But the cheap pen, its ink barely shows up on this index card because it's transparent to far red, as well as infrared, but this camera is only recording light from about 400 to 750 nanometers. This is a modified camera. The normal cutoff is 700 nanometers. And the reason for that is, as you see on this graph, silicon sensors are much more sensitive to far red. They're in fact too sensitive. That's why it distorts certain colors so much, when to our eyes it looks just like a very dark red or just dark red tinge to it. This just makes it just red, just plain red. Here is a pair of shorts here. These are supposed to be gray shorts, although with incandescent lighting, even to anybody's regular eyes, they'll look like a slightly reddish gray, and on the camera they show up like a bright pinkish red almost. Here is some pieces of far red reflecting fabric. This isn't anything special, that's just a cleaning cloth and a cut up piece of a glove. These are supposed to be black, but the dye in them reflects far red or is transparent to it, one of the two. And that's what gives them that color. Like I said, in real life they do still have some color to them, but it's not nearly as strong as it shows up as on camera. Another interesting thing is sunglasses. Those are supposed to be black colored lenses, but this camera really picks it up well. They have a red color to them on this camera because of their transparency to far red. It's a lot more than to the rest of the spectrum. So putting on a pair of cheap sunglasses, these were $5, these aren't anything special, it actually amplifies the amount of far red that you will see, because it will diminish the rest of the visible spectrum while barely diminishing the far red at all, meaning that those slight dark reddish tinges to black fabrics and stuff become a lot more pronounced. In fact, because this bulb is so bright, I am wearing sunglasses right now. Here is a solution of the ink isopropyl. I hold it up to the light and you can see the red color to it. I can see it just fine with my eyes too. It's like a very deep, intense red shining through the ink solution here from my eyes, and to the camera it shows up almost like a slight reddish orange because the camera doesn't pick it up 100% correctly. But the problem with the camera being too sensitive to far red, as you can see, this normal red fabric shows up a very strange, like bright, almost pinkish red because of this. That's why they normally have to cut off the far red. It's either they can show it and cause these kind of distortions, or they cannot show it and only lose some small color details. Here is the isopropyl solution. I'm shining my new 710nm flashlight through it. And the clearness that shows up on camera is just like how it shows up in real life. Shines right through it. But with just the regular red, as in the 660, this is how it shows up in real life too. It doesn't shine through it much. Still looks pretty black. And that's just to prove something here. It's to prove that far red isn't just part of the infrared. It actually is contributing to colors. Although it's not as significant as just, say, regular green, it does contribute to our daily colors that we see. It's also the reason why, under LED lighting, skin looks paler. Skin reflects far red fairly well, but LED lighting typically does not put out far red. So this graph, unfortunately, is not the one used by a certain international organization. Some of you may have heard about this international organization called the CIE, some French acronym that means in English International Illumination Committee or something to that effect. Problem is, their graph is not the same one that is used here, which predicts a response to the far red. Theirs shows it tailing off and hitting around zero right at the 700nm mark, which can easily be determined to not be the case with something as simple as a homemade flashlight. The graph that I obtained from the book and printed out here was made roughly in 1975, but the CIE's current luminous efficacy function, that's actually from 1929, before they had much of the technology to be able to produce monochromatic light sources to test this. There's another problem too. Human vision isn't uniform across the board, not just in quality and acuity, but also in response to different light. And you can look this up on Wikipedia. The proportions of red, green, and blue cones varies a lot from person to person. As well as that, there are some people which have a certain color deficiency, but not a complete color blindness. This is particularly common with variants of the red cone, where it can be deficient, shifted more towards the green cone's response, but not enough to qualify as colorblind. Since colorblind people represent about 8% of the male population, that means that this color deficient could represent also a fairly significant portion. They don't see red the same way that normal people do. They see it as a washed out version. They can't see deep reds as well. And they won't be able to see far red tint on anything at all, unless you shine only far red at them. And even then, they won't see it as bright as most people will. But this could be a significant portion of the population, maybe 10%. And since they can still pass a color blindness test without being qualified as colorblind, they may not even know that they have this deficiency, and the people running the test on these to form these response curves, particularly the CIE's one from 1929, would have no way to tell. This would mean that they bring down the average response and make it look like infrared starts at 700 nanometers. Well, the thing about averages is they're not always representative of a population. Remember, the average human has one breast and one testicle. That's not exactly representative of anybody. My point is that because of these easily demonstratable facts about far red, some new testing needs to be done, and the CIE's judgment on this, saying that anything over 700 nanometers infrared is not to be trusted. Another problem with calling anything over 700 nanometers infrared is that it will cause problems illuminating a room for a night vision camera. If the objective of the night vision cameras is to make it so only the camera can see, since far red is still visible, obviously and easily demonstratably so, people will still be able to easily navigate their way through the room. And right here, this is a lamp that I made. Inside there is a bulb that I've modified myself and put a 710 nanometer far red LED in. And I can actually use that to read just fine, sitting from either here or there. Obviously, if I can read with the lamp 5 to 10 feet away, that means it's not infrared. If you don't believe me that far red is not infrared, then I want you to buy some of these LEDs for yourself and test them out. According to this graph here, the response to 710 nanometers that I've marked out on the graph there, I've got it written down up there if you can read that, is about 2.1%. And that may not seem like a lot, but according to the CIE, the response at 700 nanometers and above should be less than 0.4%. But I've tested that, and at least with my own eyes, that is not the case. This graph is closer to what I can easily see than what the CIE says. A tungsten light bulb produces about 5% visible light out of its whole spectrum, because most of it is well into the infrared, like around 1,000 or 1,200 nanometers. And a far red LED is about 2.1% as bright as one of the same wattage, say at the peak at around 550, 560 nanometers. So that means that if I have a 3-watt incandescent bulb and a 3-watt far red LED, that the far red LED should be around 1/3 to 1/2 as bright as the incandescent bulb. And I've tested this, and that is correct. But according to the CIE, that same far red LED should be nowhere near the brightness of that incandescent bulb, not even 1/10 of that. And it's easy to see that that's false. It also produces a problem for actually rating the brightness of an incandescent bulb. Since the CIE considers anything over 700 nanometers infrared, and their graph is so outdated, that means they'll consistently underrate an incandescent bulb. So while the CIE may say that an incandescent bulb will only produce between 3 and 5% of its light as a visible light, it may actually produce a slightly higher, around 3 to 6% of visible light. That's because they did not account for far red, which, if you've ever seen the black body radiation curve of a tungsten filament, you notice the 700 to 800 nanometer portion is very significant compared to the portion below it. So it will contribute to a scene's color, which is easily demonstratable. Right on there, sitting on that piece of dark red fabric, I guess you would call it, is the cutoff lens from an old camera. It cuts off everything above 700 nanometers. You turn on your incandescent bulb, get out some black and gray fabrics and even some red fabrics, and you look through that. The red fabrics will look significantly duller. You'll notice red tinges on the black and gray fabrics disappear when you look through that. That's an easy way you can demonstrate to yourself far red illumination does actually contribute to a scene's color. It's not a huge amount, but it is easily demonstrated to contribute. And you can even amplify the far red coloring simply by putting on a pair of cheap sunglasses, as I'm doing right now. Well, hope that wasn't too much information. This video might be a little bit long.